This video is long overdue. Wuthering Waves is a gacha game made by Kuro Games, officially released in May 2024, where the main thing that you do is you grab the anime girl and you slap the enemy in the face as hard as you can. So anyway, we're now in January 2026, and a year and a half later, it won the Player's Voice Award on the Game Awards. Wait, what? And version 3.0 of the game dropped, alongside its two new characters Linne and Monye, who, by the way, look absolutely gorgeous. Like, look at them. It's not just them, however. The map and the overall gameplay have been a beautiful experience for many players, for veterans, returning, and new players alike. Consistently amassing multiple $1 million a month in earnings for just mobile revenue alone, that is a lot of money. Wuthering Waves has managed to accumulate a massive active player base and is particularly known by the fans for its complex combat mechanics with a lot of intricacies, not only in how to handle each enemy encounter the player may face, but also in how the game's overall meta works. With that being said, I'm fittingly named Sweat, I do the funny math on the funny anime gambling game, and today I'm gonna teach you how to best use your anime girls in combat. So today's video will follow the plan. We'll first feature a pretty simple explanation of the game's combat and gacha mechanics, then what makes characters synergize together and what a return on investment is, because that's pretty confusing. We'll then analyze each endgame mode the game provides and what kinds of characters would perform in those modes. Then finally, I'll be giving my opinion on the current state of the meta and give you all a little tier list of the best characters to use overall. Now feel free to skip forward to any points you're already very familiar with, like for example, veterans may skip the first chapter if they like, since I'm gonna cover the basics everyone learns by just playing the game. That being said, let's get started with chapter 1. Wuthering Waves is a live-action, 3D, open-world combat game inspired by games such as Genshin Impact and Zelda Breath of the Wild, for example. Its meta revolves around teams of 3 characters, with kits that have a total of 7 skills and 2 passives. That's a lot of skills, each capable of containing multiple effects according to the current character status and the input of the player, because I mean it wasn't hard enough to begin with, so the way characters can interact with each other and with the enemy can get pretty complex. Several ways to increase their strength exist, such as pulling the gacha for extra character copies and/or weapons, so in other words, spending all your life savings on a video game, and using the farmable gearing systems, those being increasing character and weapon level, skill level, and echoes, so in other words, spending your life on a video game instead. Every resource takes a while to farm, whether it be for pulling on the gacha, which also means relying on luck-based drops, or simply gearing characters properly. Each investment is costly, due to most resources being time-gated by the game's stamina system called wave plates, and hence, not all characters will be able to be utilized in combat on every account to their maximum efficiency. In fact, reaching theoretical perfection, due to how random the echo system is, which is offering random stat distributions with randomly increasing values, is for all intents and purposes impossible because 99.9% of gamblers quit right before they win big. As a result, the game's meta revolves around investing in characters that have the ability to perform as well as possible on a team against the widest variety of enemies possible and against the most battle scenarios possible, while ideally inducing the lowest cost possible. To challenge players in their account strength, a few high difficulty endgame modes exist, being Double Pawn's Matrix, which offers the highest difficulty content against single boss targets, Whimpering Waves, which focuses on AoE and multi-wave combat, and finally Tower of Adversity, which offers a mix of both, but at a lower difficulty than both game modes that target one specific aspect. So you have the 2 extremes and the in-between. Players are expected to have a minimum of 4 fully functional teams of 3 characters that are geared up to endgame level, with at least 2 of these being competent in AoE and all 4 being competent in single target at once, in order to maximize the rewards granted by each game mode. So it's pretty difficult to achieve and it takes a lot of time. Hence, the Wuthering Waves meta revolves around investing into proper teams to clear these contents as smoothly as possible. With that goal in mind, what actually constitutes a proper team? In Wuthering Waves, teams are always composed of 3 characters that can have various interactions with each other that may create synergies. All enemies and characters have elemental types, and if your character's element matches the enemy, you deal significantly less damage to them, so not all teams can work against every enemy, meaning some characters that have higher raw damage output can be outclassed by lower teams with a better suited element for the situation. This means there isn't a single team that's truly above the others, though in neutral contexts where no elements are favored, that can theoretically exist. A good example of a usual team core would be featuring a main DPS, a sub DPS / buffer character, and a support, who always features body-wide buffing, and in the most common cases also has some form of sustain, whether that be healing or shielding. This is often referred to as a hypercarry team. Using some of the characters present in this current patch, an example of such a team would be a Linne Shorekeeper team. Yuno acts as the main DPS, so she's the enemy girl doing the slapping. Linne is buffing Yuno to the max so that she can actually slap enemies as hard as she can, and finally Shorekeeper is buffing both of them at once while providing extra heals for added comfort. While healing isn't a necessary component to team building in Wuthering Waves because you can just dodge everything, in Shorekeeper's case, it allows her to use the rejuvenating level 5-piece set to buff the party's attack team-wide. Additionally, while almost every second start buffer is only buffing one character at once, and switching that character out ends the majority of their buffs, mostly in the form of outro skills, a proper third slot partner will almost always have party-wide buffing that doesn't expire upon switching between characters, which is the reason why most teams fall under this archetype. The goal is pretty simple: buff the main enemy girl as hard as you can, slap the enemy in the face as hard as you can. It's a team archetype that works well and is also really easy to conceptualize and understand, which is why most meta teams fall under this archetype. However, not all teams have to follow this archetype, despite it being the most common. Some other teams, which I'll unofficially refer to as chain systems for the sake of illustration, will instead have 3 characters all capable of dealing damage on their own, and all capable of buffing each other on their own as well. There have been several examples of this kind of team showing up recently, with for example the Frolova Cantarella Rocha and the Chengli Brand Lupa teams. Wait, is that a guy in my anime girl game? In these scenarios, all 3 party members buff each other in some capacity, mostly via their outro skills, and they take turns doing their rotations to have constant damage output on the enemy at all times because they're all capable of dealing a solid amount of damage. Still, that's not all there is to Wuthering Waves team building. Some other teams don't follow either of those archetypes, and instead use the game's mechanics in a clever way. Several teams have been conceptualized in this logic, where for example, 2 main DPS characters do their rotations simultaneously, so instead of one enemy girl slapping the enemy's face, it's actually 2, which is pretty revolutionary, I know. And they do this by abusing a technique called swap cancelling or quick swap, which means you start an attack animation with a character, you switch out, and they finish that animation while you can input other actions with another character on the field at the same time. That way, you have 2 characters, or even your whole team, casting skills on the enemy all at once for even more damage quicker. There are even teams with 2 usually second slot partners that we use for team-wide buffing instead, since it's equally, if not more advantageous than using a traditional support. For example, the Linne team can instead use Shakona, and it's in fact ideal to do so, since her weapon and some of her kit buffs apply team-wide and buff Yuno even harder. The chain system of Chengli Brand Lupa can instead use Galbrenna over Chengli, so Lupa is getting buffed less, but Galbrenna, having higher damage potential than Chengli and being buffed by the 2 of them, can outclass her in some situations. And finally, even the Frolova Cantarella Rocha team can instead use Cho Yuan because he can still leverage Frolova's outro buffs even though he doesn't really have an outro buff on his own in that team, but he's still able to provide extra damage to her via a mechanic called Echo Skills, which he specializes in, and Frolova can also benefit from. Overall, Wuthering Waves' team building has some pretty linear and easy to understand concepts, but it can also get very complex very quickly if you're trying to optimize. As a result, Kuro Games managed to create a meta that's friendly for both casual and more competitive players alike, where going for high score runs using unique teams can still feel rewarding for veterans, while new players get an experience that's rather simple to grasp and get into. With that being said, all of those teams are being crafted with the purpose of achieving the highest score or the lowest clear time in certain endgame modes. So if we bring this team building logic in that context, what does that result in? Let's find out, shall we? So here, we start getting into the actual nitty-gritty of the meta, the more complex and detailed part of learning the game. That is, applying all of the team building knowledge we have in context. Buckle up because this one's pretty long. First, let's tackle the easiest endgame to understand, Double Pawns Matrix. This is a game mode where characters have limited energy, so they can only be used for clears a single time if they're specialized, 2 times if they're generalist support like Shorekeeper, which we mentioned earlier for example. Here, we're hitting a single boss and trying to score a total of 5,000 points, which equals to dealing 5 million damage to the enemy in a maximum of 2 minutes. Now, 5 million in 2 minutes sounds like a lot, and well, that's because it is. Not only is that amount what I dream of having on my bank account, especially in 2 minutes, we have to keep in mind this is an endgame mode after all, and most commonly agreed to be the hardest one, so high difficulty is expected. It's like actually paying off your mortgage. It takes you like literally 30 years to get there, but it's pretty rewarding when it's all said and done. Since we're hitting a single boss and trying to deal a lot of damage to it, raw single target damage output is the only determining factor of what makes a team meta in this game mode. We throw AoE completely out the window and solely focus on how hard the enemy girl can stab the enemy in the face. Hence, the highest damage output team in the game is one I haven't mentioned yet, but have been showing you the footage in the background. It's the Cardathea Shakona Chisa team you're looking at right now. It's capable of scoring the highest simply because it deals the most damage to a single target over time. Since damage output is the sole metric of what makes a team good here, it's pretty easy to understand how the meta is structured. A more complicated game mode, however, would be a mode like Wuthering Waves. This is the AoE focused game mode. 2 teams are required in this game mode, but no stamina system exists, so you can just bring whoever you want as long as you have 2 teams. And however many times you want. In this mode, players can choose one among a variety of tokens, which provide certain buffs to the team, which can be absolutely massive. The strongest ones varying periodically depending on what the latest characters are, because Kuro Games needs to buff the recently released teams the hardest, otherwise they just wouldn't sell as much. So after clearing some of the smaller stages, which have a limited number of waves of enemies players need to dispatch in 2 minutes, the final stage, which is the most difficult and interesting one, has an endless wave of small to medium-sized enemies spawning in, which give you a certain amount of score upon defeating, and rewards are granted to you based on score. You need a minimum of 4,500 points, it's 2,250 points per team on average, to max out the rewards. With that being said, since the game mode is AoE centric, but also relies on multiple waves of enemies with lower HP rather than a boss spawning in constantly, having damage output over extended periods of time is especially favored. Remember the chain system teams I was talking about earlier in the video? Yeah, so those have constant damage output and they're really strong there. Like in fact, the Frolova team in specific is literally the strongest team in the mode and it's not even close. Why? Because she and her team have constant damage output on and off field, thanks to her damage being split half and half, roughly, between herself and Hecate, an echo that she summons to fight the enemies as she is off field. Also having the best crowd control capabilities in the game and very high damage output, she is quite literally the definition of broken in this game mode. On any Wuthering Waves tier list that's well researched, for example let's self-glaze and pick Pridwin because I work there and I'm totally not biased, she is so far ahead that she's the only top tier unit. She centralizes the meta like she's Meta Knight from Super Smash Bros. Brawl, it's to that extent. Other teams that perform well in the mode are teams that have multiple high damaging characters present on the team at once, such as a team with Augusta and Yuno who both deal high damage. A lot of quick swap teams are also very strong, like for example if the Cardathea team is played to the max in quick swap, And of course, the chain systems I mentioned earlier, like Changli Brent Looper, are very good. Like, I already glazed the ever-living hell out of Falova, but Malfusion is quite performant as well there. Finally, some teams fully lean into the tokens that the game mode provides permanently, and they exploit them to their fullest. For example, the Plunderer Abuse team is one of the strongest in the game mode, and it uses 3 healers built with electro damage because one of the tokens in the game mode that is permanently accessible, called the Plunderer Captain's Seal, deals big blasts of AoE electro damage after receiving enough healing ticks. Look at how stupid this looks in the background. The worst part is that it's working a bit too well, like come on. So the Plunderer Abuse team and the Falova team are in fact so far ahead of the competition that they're able to still hit resistant enemies to their element and they still perform. Like, they're so strong that they just don't care and clear anyway when played and built properly. Lastly, there's the Tower of Adversity, the last of the 3 endgame modes. This game mode will require much less explanation than the previous 2 because it's simply a combination of both. Characters have a limited amount of energy, requiring you to play multiple different teams. Varying temporary buffs that make the latest released teams much stronger are present. There are a lot of easy floors that culminate into the much more difficult Hazard Tower, named Middle Tower by the community. Characters want both AoE and single target on certain floors, like the 2nd and 3rd floors of the Middle Tower, while on some other floors, characters can get away with only single target capabilities, like the 1st and the 4th and final floor of the Middle Tower. Here, multi-wave capabilities are not as important, so characters like Jinshi, who have a wide AoE but only concentrated in a couple key abilities, can perform totally fine on all floors, even though the poor girl, she sucks in Wuthering Waves. Additionally, characters like Thea, who are strong in Matrix for their raw damage output, are awesome, and characters like Falova, who have a wide AoE while still retaining solid damage output, are also very strong as well. Hence, since bosses have a lower barrier to clear them and multi-wave is not as emphasized, Tower Adversity requires both of the specializations of Matrix and Wuthering Waves, but also has less steep requirements, making it a balance of both extremes. Now that I've given a full overview of all endgame modes and illustrated what kind of teams would be effective in their contexts, let's talk about one of the most important elements affecting Wuthering Waves team building, the gacha. Wuthering Waves is a gacha game where, like I said earlier, not only are all teams not created equal, they also have varying costs. While 99.9% of gamblers do quit right before they win big, chain systems require all of the characters on the team to be fully decked out and optimized for damage, since they're all contributing to a bigger total. Like, for example, if you tank a 10% damage loss on 3% of your total damage, that's only 0.3% of your total damage being lost. But if you lose that 10% on your 40% of your total damage, that's a much more significant 4% being lost party-wide. That means chain systems will tend to be quite expensive on either your time or your wallet, or maybe even both. The more upgrades you miss out on with your entire team, the more you're penalized, where hypercarry teams can get away with less on 2 of the 3 party members, because it won't affect the total damage as much. That's important because you can only gamble for so long until the funds run out after all, like the house always wins. In a game where all of the resources are scarce and time limited, and hence where you invest them counts a lot, teams that are cheaper to get up and running to the standard of endgame modes are very favored. Similarly, for buffing and supporting characters, if they can slot into a wide variety of teams, that's a huge plus, since the more Yuno gets to cheat on her wife Augusta, the better off she is because NTR is pretty cool. Sorry, I meant they'll serve you not only for several teams with different specializations on your current roster, they'll also serve you for future teams that you pull and build. Lastly, since characters, their sequence nodes, and their weapons all cost gacha currency and require pulling on the gacha, the latter part being entirely luck dependent and the former part being entirely wallet and or time dependent, the less upgrades teams require to function in the endgame, the more value they hold. Additionally, the more endgame modes they're very efficient in, the more value they're going to hold as well. Having the widest coverage for the lowest cost makes you the best. Now, let's talk about what I personally think of everything I just covered, and finally, I'll be giving you guys the promised endgame tier list you were waiting for. So in Wuthering Waves, what determines the meta to most will be return on investment. In a game where resources are scarce and top performance isn't strictly required, getting the best bang for your buck is essentially what most players should be aiming towards in order to clear the endgame content quickly and smoothly at minimal expenses. As a matter of fact, the game is fully free-to-play accessible, provided your free gacha currency is properly spent for casuals, or provided you play well enough for players willing to optimize their gameplay to the fullest. Even bottom tiers can clear content if played well enough. To draw a comparison from earlier, it's the same way a bottom tier Smash Bros. Brawl character played by a pro can win against a Meta Knight played by a casual player in a tournament setting. Even though one of them is centralizing the meta, skill is compensating for that factor. Hence, a meta gets carved out where effective value is determined by the widest variety of team usage for hybrid buffers and supports, and raw damage output in all endgame scenarios for DPS. This is because the more buffers and supports are universally applicable, the more they alleviate the pressure of players having to spend for future dedicated partners for the DPS they want to utilize, while the DPS themselves are doing the heavy lifting. Now, what do I personally make of that? Well, I personally think that without mentioning which ones, given the circumstances of a large number of gacha games on the market having a lot of pay-to-win elements and mechanics that strongly encourage spending for performance, Kuro Games managed to create a good balance between rewarding spenders for their support of the game and free-to-play players for their time spent playing it. Wuthering Waves doesn't feel like there's an imbalance between insurmountable obstacles for free-to-play players highly encouraging spending, or making spending feel useless because the game is too free-to-play friendly. Kuro did a great job at balancing in that regard. While some character kits definitely aren't perfect, looking at negative status characters saying that, and the launch period of the game was undeniably a pretty wacky experience, Kuro has kept on improving both from a meta standpoint and simply from a general standpoint on how fun the game is. The story has gotten significantly better, especially recently with version 3.0. We just got animations for Amy publicized as I'm writing this, and honestly, the way Kuro keeps outdoing themselves is just impressive to me. I do have my gripes with the meta. As I mentioned, I think the negative status archetype wasn't done well at all due to forcing the acquisition and usage of dedicated supports for every negative status you pull. Like, Zani should not need Phoebe for her to serve the basic purpose of functioning properly, bro, what is this? And as a result, some team archetypes are definitely handled better than others. Additionally, the meta being scaled off of owning the signature weapons of every character makes certain units like Chisa and Roshia really redundant and unnecessary to own, since characters with a much lower cost, in both cases being completely free, can perform their roles just as well. Finally, some of the endgame content, and by far the most guilty of this is Wuthering Waves, leans way too hard into abusing temporary buffs for the current and recent on-banner characters, which really pushes frequent spending in that game mode if players didn't pull for the top meta units already. So overall, while Wuthering Waves' meta isn't perfectly fair to every character, which that's bound to be the case, it definitely has a lot going for it in terms of balancing, and acquiring the units needed to handle all sorts of situations is only a matter of time investment for free-to-play players for up to a few months of progress, if that's what they're targeting the most. Spending only speeds up and facilitates that process rather than it being necessary. Now finally, for those who are awaiting the tier list, I'll start with the top tier characters and go down. Let's get into this. So each character is assumed to be played in their best role. This looks at overall value as per the criteria I detailed in this entire video, so it should be pretty self-explanatory. Remember, characters in the same tier are not ordered, this is important, so characters in the same tier are all possessing the same value that is specified by the tier name. There's no character in the same tier being stronger than this character in the same tier too, that's not a thing. So here are the tiers we'll be using. What they mean should be self-explanatory enough, hopefully. So, in GOAT status, we're gonna have Frolova, Shorekeeper, and Verena. These characters are so valuable, I cannot argue for a reason not to get them. Frolova is the one and only queen of Wuthering Waves and has the raw damage output of a monster, which is plenty for Tower and Matrix. Her only caveat is you really want either her signature or one premium teammate, and she can work with only one of the two, so either a weapon or the teammates, you'll be fine. She can even work as a heavy attack buffer, and she can play as a huge crowd control and damage focused sub DPS instead. She's the only DPS I would glaze this hard. Actually, it's not even glaze, it's just facts. Shorekeeper and Verena probably don't need much explaining though, like they're the two universal supports we got right now. You can use them everywhere in every team ever made, and they require near zero investment to work, just energy regen and like level 50, and that's it. Then we got the highly valuable characters, almost goat status, but not quite. Augusta is one who wants her signature weapon, and other than that you got the full team in Mortefi and Verena or Shorekeeper. It can be improved further with Yuno, and it works everywhere. Speaking of Yuno, she can function as both a DPS and a buffer and get top tier performance, which is huge. Now, she needs either her signature weapon as a DPS or premium teammates to work as a buffer, but that's only really a big deal in Tower or Matrix as a DPS though. We then have Lupa, Linné, and Mortefi. None of them really care about having their signature weapon, except maybe Lupa a little bit. Even still, not a huge loss. They all work insanely well for the archetype they specialize in. Linné specializes in almost nothing. She's just a general buffer with slightly higher buffs to liberation damage, but like who cares? Like she just gets better in liberation teams than she already is, and she's already more than good enough. Now, Lupa carries an entire element being fusion, and Mortefi is super good for all heavy attack damage dealers, which we have a lot of right now, and most importantly, the guy is free, he's a 4-star. Now, we have the really good characters, so those usually have one major flaw. That's kind of it, really. Other than that, they're just pretty good. Codithea, Shakona, and Arrow Rover all work together, and they are the best tower adversity team in the game with an asterisk, you'll see later. Arrow Rover is an arrow support who has their signature weapon completely given out for free, their sequences as well, and they don't need big investment. They have an amazing synergy with Shakona in all Arrow teams, who, by the way, does not need her signature to work, and Arrow is pretty meta right now, to say the least. That includes Codithea, who wants her signature, really likes having Shakona too, but you get huge return on investment in the form of having the best tower and matrix DPS in the game. Galbrenna is also here because she doesn't need her signature, and she has a good free-to-play teammate in Mortefi, while working pretty well across all game modes, except maybe not being as strong in Whimpering, similarly to Codithea. However, she's much less strong with Mortefi than Augusta, and ideally, when it comes to Galbrenna, you want a premium teammate. Then we have the good value in best team characters, and those are explained by their tiers. I'll detail the best teams so you have them. Chengli and Brand go with Lupa, Choyuwen and Cantabella go with Filova, Zani, Phoebe and Spectre Over go together, Colada and Jaja go together, and finally Encore is the only real outlier here, but that's because she isn't the strongest, permanently accessible DPS team in the game, and she really puts in work for beginners with Sanhua, while also gaining massive stonks with Lupa if you want to invest in her further. Only issue is, Encore sucks in Whimpering, but at least she's permanently accessible and she's good at that. Now we start entering the tier where characters are too niche for me to deem worthwhile in most scenarios, but if you want their niche use, you might want to get them. Chisa is the best first slot for Codithea and Shakona theoretically, but she needs either significant investment via her signature and echoes, or significant optimization with strong echoes too, so it's kind of hard to suggest her over Arrow Rover, but theoretically she's better. It's kind of a hard position to be in. And then Jian, he can be good with Yuno and or Shakona across all game modes, but he's stealing from much stronger damage dealers who partner with them, like Augusta and Codithea, or just Yuno as a DPS on her own. For the free options, Havoc Rover is a free-to-play DPS for everything but Whimpering if you're in a pinch. Dungeon is very good for Filova as a free-to-play option, but she gets outclassed by premium choices. And finally, Bruling and Yohu are part of Plunderer abuse in Whimpering if you want to invest in that to obliterate the modes, but they're restricted to it. Bruling can, however, work as a free-to-play support, particularly for skill damage dealers, but she's also generally outclassed by Verena, who's just completely free. And finally, the characters in our last tier are just not worth their cost, whether it comes to return on investment or their cost of attention compared to above characters. I would only advise you to pick one of them up if they happen to be your favorite character in the game. Otherwise, I would tell you to skip them because they're either power crept, don't have a best team to be played in, or have too high costs to justify pulling them over any of the above options compared to what you're getting in exchange for that cost. Oh, and just kidding, I totally forgot Sanhua and Mornier, whose values are entirely speculative. Now, Monia is not released yet, as I'm making this video, and Sanhua is awaiting a potential basic attack DPS in the form of Luke in the next patch, so in the coming months. Though this isn't confirmed, with the limited information I have to work with, I expect Sanhua to be in the really good tier with Luke as her main DPS, while Monia ends up in either GOAT status or highly valuable, since she's almost definitely generalist support like Shorekeeper and Verena. Sanhua herself is a very cheap, almost costless basic attack buffer, who I would currently place in the niche tier if I had to. However, we haven't got a basic attack main DPS since over a year ago with Camellia, way back in 1.4, we're now in 3.0 by the way, so her value just isn't good right now. Placing her in the niche tier wouldn't do her justice with an upcoming DPS for her to pair with on the horizon though. Now, as the last thing in this video, I'll be featuring a small rant where I'm just explaining what my future plans are for the channel, so where everything's headed. If you don't care about that, then that's totally fine, and I thank you for watching this until the end, but before you leave, like, comment, subscribe. Oh my god, getting the script done was a mouthful. This is my first time recording a script and I had to have it go on for more than 30 minutes. Oh my god, this was a big video to make, huh? Okay, so I'm gonna quit the yap. I'm gonna talk about the things that are pretty important that you should know for this channel. For example, like, what am I gonna post exactly? Because this video is a cool meta overview and all, but like, I haven't exactly specified that. So here's the thing. I'm gonna introduce myself real quick. I am Sweat. I do theory crafting, a lot of it. I do the math. I've said that in the intro, but I don't know if it was too explicit that, for example, I work for Pridwin, you know, the big, like, gacha game guide website and stuff. I do my own calcs in the background as well. I'm not solely associated with that brand. Please, I am my own person. That's something I've been dealing with for a while. My entire identity has just been Pridwin guy. Please, I do other things. Okay. This is already just going in the wackiest direction I could not have imagined this. So yes, I will be making a lot of informational content. I will be making that. You can expect some guides, you can expect some rotations, you can expect me to discuss the characters' meta values, and you can expect some discussion videos in general. Like, for example, one of the ideas that I have, I don't know when it's coming, but eventually I'll be discussing why I don't like negative status. I mentioned it in this video, but like, I'll be discussing it in more depth. And okay, another thing that I want to do eventually is open a Discord server. My next video in line is a Monia guide. Yes, I'll be making that next. And then after that, I'll probably be making a bunch of Monia related content because I just love her. I am completely out of breath from speaking for over 30 minutes and having to re-record this a total of 40 times in separate takes. That's how many takes this took. Yeah. Wow, making this has been a beautiful experience. I am really looking forward to making more content. And oh yeah, by the way, since I'm gonna open a Discord, if I happen to know you and you're watching this video right now, if I happen to know you from before, you know, I started YouTube and stuff, you can contact me if you wanna be a moderator. I'm gonna be needing some of those. I don't have infinite time on my hands. Yeah, I guess that's about it. I'll be leaving you guys, and yeah, this should be the last time I'm making one of those at the end of a video, unless I have some important things to say, but that should be in the far future. Until then, yeah, I'll see you in the next one, and thank you for sticking around and listening to this. You're the best. Bye.